So either the greatest economy in human history somehow accidentally left half its population behind, or it didn't leave them behind at all. It cashed them out. There's a difference. When a company gets liquidated, its valuable assets get sold off, its debts get restructured, often transferred, and what's left gets quietly dissolved. Liquidation always has a beneficiary, and by the end of this, you'll know exactly who collected. In 1971, 61% of Americans considered themselves middle class. Today, that number is 50%. But here's the part that should keep you up at night. During that exact same period, the stock market went up over 4,000%. US GDP tripled. Corporate profits broke all-time records 11 times in the last decade alone. So either the greatest economy in human history somehow accidentally left half its population behind, or it didn't leave them behind at all. It cashed them out. There's a difference. And that difference is the whole story. Now, liquidated is a financial term. When a company gets liquidated, its valuable assets get sold off, its debts get restructured, often transferred, and what's left gets quietly dissolved. Liquidation always has a beneficiary, and by the end of this, you'll know exactly who collected. Now, you've heard some version of this before, the standard story. Let's run through it quickly, because the standard story is exactly how they want you to think about this. Wages aren't keeping up with costs. Everything is more expensive. Your parents had it easier. We've all nodded along to this at a dinner table at some point. And yeah, the data backs it up. According to Pew Research, the American middle class, defined as households earning between $56,000 and $169,000 a year, has been shrinking for 50 consecutive years. 50. Not a blip, not a recession hiccup. Half a century of slow, steady decline. Meanwhile, the bottom tier grew. The top tier grew. The middle just compressed. Most coverage frames this as economic gravity. Just the natural shifting of a modern economy. Automation, globalization, bad luck. The kind of thing that sounds inevitable when you say it fast enough. The approved villains are safe and systemic, blame-free, faceless, and conveniently impossible to hold accountable. There's even a tidy academic theory for it. The hollowing out hypothesis. Middle-skill jobs disappeared. Workers either moved up into higher-paying knowledge work or down into lower-paying service work. The middle just evaporated. Natural market forces. Tragic but inevitable. The Federal Reserve's own data shows the upper-income tier share of aggregate U.S. income rose from 29% in 1970 to 49% by 2020. The lower income tier grew from 16 to 29% of adults in that same window. The middle absorbed the losses on both ends, and real median wage growth from 2000 to 2023, about 15% total over 23 years. After inflation, that's not a living, that's a treadmill. If you're already feeling uncomfortable, hit subscribe. We're only at the surface. Now, the hollowing out theory is tidy. It's comfortable, and it completely misses what's actually happening, because this doesn't look like natural economic drift. It looks like a controlled demolition, and controlled demolitions have engineers. But what most people haven't noticed is that every single mechanism doing the damage was either built deliberately or deliberately left in place. To understand that, you need to understand how two completely different economies have been running inside the same country at the same time for the last 50 years. There are two ways to build wealth in America. You either sell your labor, your time, your skills, your effort, or you sell the output of your assets, your property, your stocks, your capital. For most of the 20th century, those two tracks ran roughly parallel. A factory worker could own a home that appreciated. A teacher's pension compounded with the market. The labor track and the capital track were both functional vehicles for the same destination, stability. Then, somewhere around the late 1970s, a quiet set of policy shifts happened, and the two tracks started to diverge. The productivity pay gap. It has its own name because it's that well documented. According to the Economic Policy Institute, worker productivity in America has risen approximately 64% since 1979. Typical worker pay up about 17% over that same period. The gap between what workers produce and what they get paid for producing it has been widening for 4 decades straight. Meanwhile, the S&P 500 is up roughly 500% since the year 2000. Real wages, inflation adjusted, are up about 15% over that same period. So if you own assets, you've been getting rich in your sleep. If you sell your time, you've been running on a treadmill that's also slowly speeding up. The middle class, almost entirely on the treadmill. Now, 3 specific policy shifts caused this divergence, and none of them were accidents. Pensions became 401ks, which sounds like a minor administrative change, but actually transferred all investment risk from employers directly onto workers. We'll get to why that matters in a moment. Union membership in the private sector collapsed from roughly 14% in the early 1980s to about 6% today. Union contracts used to tie wages to productivity. When that mechanism broke, the productivity pay pay gap opened, and nobody closed it. The third shift is the one most people overlook, the financialization of the American mortgage. Or in plain English, taking a loan between a family and a local bank and turning it into a product that Wall Street could package, trade, leverage, and fee. The 30-year fixed mortgage went from a community banking instrument to a globally traded security, and as we'll get to, that transformation had consequences for housing that are still accelerating today. Now, the middle class relies almost entirely on the labor track, a salary, an hourly wage, maybe one asset, a house, which as we'll get to has been turned into something closer to a weapon against them. The upper class makes its money from capital, stocks, commercial real estate, private equity, investment income, things that don't depend on showing up to work. That's the machinery. Now let's look at who built it, who operates it, and who's getting paid. According to the Federal Reserve's distributional financial accounts, the top 1% of Americans, roughly 3.3 million people, owns approximately $50 trillion in wealth. The bottom 50%, about 165 million Americans, holds around $4 trillion, on a total national wealth base of 156 trillion. And here's what makes this more than just a rich get richer story. The wealth isn't just accumulating above the middle class, it's being extracted from the middle class. There are three specific mechanisms for doing it. Let's go through each one, but it gets worse. Let's start with housing, the single biggest asset the middle class was supposed to own. In 1985, the median U.S. home cost about 3 times the median household income. Expensive, sure, but achievable. You saved for a few years, you bought, you built equity, you passed something on to your kids. That was the deal. That was the contract. Today, the median home costs roughly 7 to 8 times median household income in most major metros. In San Francisco or New York, we're talking 15 to 20 times. Now, you might say, and to play devil's advocate here, interest rates were around 12% in 1985. Today, they're around 7%. So monthly payments are somewhat comparable on paper. Fair. Except that argument falls apart the moment you look at what happened between 2012 and 2023. After the 2008 crash, when millions of middle-class families lost their homes, institutional investors stepped in. Private equity firms like Blackstone, Invitation Homes, and dozens of smaller funds bought distressed properties by the thousands. According to the Wall Street Journal, institutional investors owned roughly 3% of all single-family rentals in 2012. By 2022, in some Sunbelt markets, they owned over 20%. Now, 3 to 20% doesn't sound like a takeover nationally. And to be fair, institutions still own a small percentage of all housing in aggregate, but they don't need to own everything to control the price signal. They just need to compete aggressively at the entry level, the $200,000 to $400,000 range, where first-time buyers and middle-class families shop. And that's exactly what they did, often paying cash, often above asking price, often in bulk transactions that individual buyers simply cannot compete with. The result? Homeownership rates for people under 40 have collapsed. According to the Urban Institute, the home ownership gap between younger and older Americans is now at its widest point since World War II. The middle class's primary wealth-building vehicle, the starter home, is being systematically bid away from them by entities with trillion-dollar balance sheets. And oh, would you look at that. Those same entities then rent the houses back to the people who couldn't buy them. The asset moved up. The monthly payment stayed with the middle class, just rebranded from mortgage to rent. That's not a housing market. That's a liquidation event. But it gets worse. Medical debt is now the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States. The leading cause in the wealthiest country in human history. According to a 2022 study in the American Journal of Public Health, roughly 100 million Americans, almost 1 in 3, carry some form of medical debt. And the primary victims aren't the poor. They're the middle class. People with jobs. People with insurance. People who did everything right. Because here's the mechanism nobody puts plainly enough. The deductible trap. The average employer-sponsored health insurance deductible is now over $1,700 per person per year. For a family plan, the Kaiser Family Foundation puts it at $3,000 to $5,000, meaning before your insurance covers a single dollar of care, you're already paying thousands out of pocket every year just to access the coverage you're paying monthly premiums for. Smash that like button if this is starting to connect. The Federal Reserve found that nearly 40% of Americans cannot cover an unexpected $400 expense. So when a $3,000 deductible hits after a hospitalization, and 3 days in a U.S. hospital is not an unusual bill trigger. A middle-class family with a mortgage, a car payment, and 2 kids doesn't have a safety net. They have a credit card. And medical debt doesn't behave like other debt. You didn't choose it. You didn't negotiate it. In some cases, you were handed a bill while you were unconscious, and now you owe it. Healthcare costs in the U.S. increased by roughly 200% since 2000 after inflation. Wages increased by 15%. The math doesn't close. It was never designed to close. To play devil's advocate, Germany has universal health healthcare with lower GDP per capita than the United States. Medical bankruptcy there is essentially non-existent. The argument that America simply can't afford to cap out-of-pocket exposure falls apart the moment you look at a country that's doing exactly that with less money. But it gets worse. In 1980, the average annual cost of a 4-year public university, tuition, fees, room and board, was roughly $3,500. In today's dollars, that's about $12,000. The actual cost today? Over $28,000 per year at a public university. Over $58,000 at a private one. Americans now hold approximately $1.77 trillion in student loan debt. Trillion, with a T. And here's what makes this a weapon specifically aimed at the middle class. The system was sold as a meritocracy. Work hard, go to college, get a good job, enter the middle class. The American dream, updated for the knowledge economy. But what it actually did was take a generation of 18-year-olds who legally cannot rent a car because they're considered too young to understand risk and hand them $40,000, $80,000, $120,000 in non-dischargeable debt. Non-dischargeable, meaning you cannot get rid of it in bankruptcy. It follows you. It garnishes your wages. It offsets your tax refund. For those keeping track, a homeowner can go bankrupt and discharge a mortgage. A corporation can go bankrupt and discharge its debts. But a 22-year-old with $75,000 in federal loans cannot discharge that debt under any normal legal circumstance. Remember when we talked about the productivity pay gap in the beginning? Wages up 15% since 2000. The degree that was supposed to get you off the labor track and onto the capital track now costs 6 figures and still leaves you on the labor track, just with debt attached. The system that was supposed to create middle-class mobility became one of its primary mechanisms of debt bondage. Now let's zoom out, because taken individually, each of these things, housing costs, medical debt, student loans, wage stagnation, can be explained away. Bad luck, market forces, individual choices. But when you line them all up across 50 years, a different picture emerges. There's one more piece that ties all of this together, and it's a number you've heard 1,000 times. The official inflation figure, the Consumer Price Index, CPI, currently sitting at around 3 to 4%. You may have noticed that your life doesn't feel 3 to 4% more expensive. Here's why. CPI measures a basket of goods, and that basket is deliberately constructed to smooth out volatility. It includes categories like used car prices, apparel, electronics, things that often deflate over time because of technology and global manufacturing. What it systematically underweights are the 3 things the middle class actually needs to maintain middle class status: housing, healthcare, and education. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies found that real housing costs for renters have increased over 40% since 2000 after inflation. Real healthcare out-of-pocket exposure up roughly 100% since 2000. Real college costs up over 150%. But the official inflation number? Relatively calm, which means every system calibrated to CPI, Social Security adjustments, wage benchmarks, federal poverty lines, systematically undercompensates middle-class households for the actual cost of their lives. But it gets worse. The mid-20th century American middle class was not a natural outcome. It was a policy project. The GI Bill, the interstate highway system, the 30-year fixed mortgage, the employer pension, the unionized factory floor. These were deliberately designed instruments that built a mass middle class, partly out of genuine political will, partly out of fear of what happened in Europe when working classes were left with nothing. Starting in the late 1970s, those instruments got dismantled one by one. Each change came with an argument: efficiency, modernization, competitiveness. The cumulative effect was identical across all of them. The infrastructure of middle-class stability was replaced with a debt-financed simulation of it. You still live in a house. You just rent it from a private equity fund. You still have healthcare. You just have a $4,000 deductible. You still went to college. You just have $60,000 in permanent debt. From the outside, it looks like the middle class. From the inside, it's a facade held together with borrowed money. Germany, Denmark, Canada, Japan, every comparable developed economy faced the same technological disruption and global competitive pressures. None of them produced wealth inequality like this, because all of them maintained, and in some cases strengthened, the policy infrastructure protecting labor. America chose repeatedly to prioritize capital returns instead. That's not an accident of history. It's a series of choices made by specific people who benefited from them. So what happens now? I'd love to give you a policy solution, a clean ending, a hero. There isn't one. The political will to rebuild middle-class infrastructure collides directly with the lobbying budgets of every industry that spent 50 years profiting from the current arrangement. The healthcare industry alone spent over $750 million lobbying Congress in 2023. Real estate and financial industries have ranked in the top 5 lobbying sectors every year for 2 decades. The middle class has a vote. vote, which gets cast every few years, and often, for reasons that would take another entire video to unpack, gets directed against its own economic interests. Remember how we opened. The economy keeps winning. The middle class keeps losing. Both are simultaneously true. We now know why. The economy stopped being the middle class's economy. It runs on capital returns now. The middle class runs on labor, and labor lost. GDP will keep growing. Markets will hit new highs. Unemployment will stay low. The CPI will say everything is fine, and the lived experience of the median American family will keep quietly diverging from those headline numbers. The liquidation doesn't need to announce itself. That's what makes it quiet. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.